Dust hung in the air like judgment. It clung to Rachel Abernethy's lashes as the wind swept through the town square of Deadwood Ridge, a place where men cheered gang fights louder than sermons and gallows creaked more often than cherry deors. Rachel stood on the wooden platform, hands bound in front of her, rope looped loosely around her neck. The sun beat down with the fury of hellfire, and a crowd gathered with bloodlust cloaked in righteousness. She didn't weep. She didn't beg. She just looked forward, eyes fixed on nothing, jaw clenched against trembling. The sheriff's voice rang out, dry and cold as bone. Rachel May Abernethy, found guilty in the unlawful murder of Judge Marcus Dunn. Sentence, hanging by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on your soul. Somewhere in the crowd, a child cried. Elsewhere, a man hawked tobacco and called it justice. Rachel exhaled slowly, trying not to picture the last time she'd seen the judge's blood on her hands. She hadn't killed him, but that didn't matter. She was a woman alone, and he had been the law. And the law did not die quietly. The executioner stepped forward. Rachel closed her eyes. Then came the sound, an unnatural snap of wind. An arrow sliced through the air, singing like a hawk's cry. It struck the rope just above her neck, splintering it. The weight fell from her throat. She gasped as her knees buckled. The crowd screamed. The sheriff reached for his revolver. Hose pounded. Dust exploded. A lone rider stormed into the chaos, dark as midnight, his long black hair braided with feathers, his chest painted with war colors. He didn't shout. He didn't pause. He leaned down from his galloping horse, scooped Rachel into the saddle behind him, and vanished before a single bullet was fired. They rode hard. Trees blurred past. The landscape shifted from town to wilderness in minutes. Civilization left in their wake like a dream turned nightmare. Rachel clung to him instinctively, not out of trust, but because there was no other option between her and the ground moving at 30 miles an hour. His body was strong, solid, nothing like the drunken men who'd whisper slurs as she walked past their porches. By the time they stopped, night had fallen. They were in the high mesas, where shadows leaned longer and silence settled heavier. He dismounted, pulling her gently down with one arm. She stumbled but remained upright. Her wrists were still bound. Her dress was torn, her throat red and bruised. He lit a fire without a word, his movements efficient. She sat across from him. He'd speak the same hate she'd fled. But he didn't. He carved a piece of wood instead, a bud perhaps, or a spirit. Who are you? She asked, was Britta. Why did you help me? He looked up, eyes the color of storm clouds, ancient and readable. He said nothing. She noticed his hands were calloused, the scars on his arms crisscrossed like mats of forgotten battles. I didn't kill him, she whispered. I didn't kill the judge. Still silence. Why risk your life for me? You don't even know me. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and slow, like water over rocks. You were bound, afraid, like my mother before the soldiers came. Rachel blinked. Her breath caught. The firelight flickered across his face, illuminating pain he didn't try to hide. He held out the carved bud. She didn't reach for it, not yet. My name's Rachel, she said softly, her words trembling more than her hands. Rachel Abernethy. He nodded. Tahoma. She tried to smile, but her lips split. Blood welled. Tahoma passed her a scrap of cloth without expression. She took it. Thank you, she muttered. They ate quietly, jerky and some root he had foraged. Rachel watched him with caution. He moved like someone who knew how to disappear. He listened like someone who'd seen too much to ask questions. She tried to piece together what had just happened. The judge had promised her protection, Vance, until he'd cornered her in his study, leaking of whiskey, and accused her of betrayal. She tried to leave. He hadn't let her. The gun went off, but it wasn't hers. She leaned back against a rock. The stars above were colder than the ground below. "They'll come after us," she said aloud. Tahoma simply nodded. "They always come." She stared at him. "Why do you do it? Why not let me hang?" His eyes met hers. "Because not all things deserve to die just because white men say so." The words hit harder than any slap. Rachel looked down at her bruised wrists, her broken pride. She didn't know this man, but something in his voice made her believe he knew her better than anyone had in years. Tandon rumbled in the distance. He glanced toward it, eyes narrowing. "You can leave me," she offered. "I'll go my own way." He stood, shook his head. "You'll die," he said simply. "They won't stop." "Then neither will I," she answered. He regarded her for a long moment, then walked to her side, cut her bindings loose with a knife-shaped like bone. She rubbed her wrists. They stood there, two silhouettes against a burning sky, not quite allies, not yet friends. Rachel looked at him again. "Tahoma, what does it mean?" "Tandon," he said. She smirked. "Fitting." He looked away. They sat in silence for a while longer. The fire cracked. Wolves howled far off. Rachel shivered, pulled the blanket tighter. He threw another log on the flames. When she finally lay down on the hard earth, her thoughts were no longer consumed with gallows or ghosts, but with a man who had no reason to save her and still did. The morning brought no warmth. Frost clung to the edge of Rachel's dress as she crouched near the embers, rubbing her hands together, stealing glances at the man who'd pulled her from a noose. Tahoma moved with quiet purpose, gathering dried herbs, folding a woven pouch, checking the horse's hooves. He hadn't said more than a handful of words since cutting her free, but he didn't have to. His silence spoke of things long buried. She followed him reluctantly at first, wary of everything, of the wilderness, of his unreadable expressions, of the sharp edge tucked into his boot. But as days passed and the trail widened and in the copper sky, she noticed the way he always rode behind her, not ahead. The way he handed her water before taking his share. The way he slept with his face toward the dark. They crossed canyons and skirted towns swollen with bounty posters. Rachel had cut her hair with a jagged knife, tied it up and in a hat. Her dress, once delicate and pale, now bore the look of something battered in. Every step south was a mile bought with stolen time. At dusk one evening, they stopped at a ravine where the water still trickled. Rachel knelt and splashed her face, her reflection flickering like a stranger's. She looked older than she remembered. Tahoma crouched beside her, dipping a. She studied the long scar on his forearm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. "Where'd you get that?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Promise I made." "What kind?" His fingers paused on the leather strap. "To never let another woman scream while men watched." Rachel swallowed. Something heavy settled between them, not fear, but understanding. She didn't ask who the woman was. She didn't need to. Pain had its own language. They camped in a dry arrow that night. Rachel insisted on gathering wood. Tahoma watched her fumble with the flint, her fingers too stiff, too raw. When she finally sparked a flame, she grinned with pride. He nodded once in approval, then reached into his pouch and handed her a thin slice of smoked meat. They ate in silence. The fire danced. She shifted closer, brushing a twig from her skirt. "I was a school teacher," she said quietly. "Back in Kansas. Before the war, Tahoma looked up. I had a fiancé, she continued. He went off with the cavalry. Never came back. The judge said he'd protect me, offered me work. Said I was lucky. But men like him don't want to protect. They want to own. He looked at the fire, then into her eyes. You fought back. She hesitated. I tried to leave. He locked the doors. Said no one would believe me. That night, some men fired again. I don't remember pulling the trigger. I remembered the blood. On his desk. On my hands. Tahoma didn't blink. Truth don't matter when law belongs to liars. Rachel stared at him. That sentence struck something in her chest, something too broken to name. She felt the sting of tears but forced them back. She had cried enough. The next morning, clouds rolled in fast. Thunder muttered behind the hills. Tahoma glanced upward, nostrils flaring like the horses before a storm. They rode hard through the narrowing trail. Trees swayed violently. By midday, rain hammered them sideways. They found a shallow cave near the ridge and took shelter inside. Rachel wrapped her shawl tighter. Tahoma built a fire out of wet kindling, patient as stone. She sat, knees drawn to her chest, watching droplets race down the cave walls. Her teeth chattered. Tahoma stood and removed his blanket, draping it around her shoulders. You'll freeze, she protested. He shook his head. You cold-un. Their eyes met. In the fire's glow, his features softened, still fierce, but less distant. She looked away, unsure how to hold the weight of that gaze. When the rain eased, they stepped outside. Fog called across the landscape. Tahoma pointed toward the southern range. Mexico. 3 days. Rachel felt a strange pang in her chest. And then, he tilted his head. Then you live. And you? She asked. He didn't answer. They pressed on through soaked array and down trees. By evening, they reached an abandoned homestead, walls sagging end and edge. Inside, a broken cradle lay in the corner. Rachel brushed dust from a wooden table. Tahoma secured the door. She walked toward the hearth, finger tracing a cracked family portrait still hanging above it. This place had hope, Vance, she murmured. Hope don't last when hunger stays, he replied. Rachel nodded. She sat down, pulling the blanket around her knees. He sat across from her, close but not too close. I should have died on that platform, she said suddenly. No, Tahoma replied, simple and sure. She glanced up. Why are you doing this? His answer came slowly, like wind through pine. Because they call me savage. And maybe I am. But I know mercy. I know justice too. Rachel let the words sink in. She had no defense against kindness, especially not when it came from someone the world had written of as unworthy of giving it. That night she had a dream. In it, the noose hung from the sky itself, and her feet dangled over 1,000 faces, none of them Tahoma's. She woke breathless. He was already awake, sharpening his knife by firelight. She said nothing. He didn't ask. As dawn broke, they packed quietly. Before mounting, she looked back at the ruined house. A bird landed on the sill, flapped once, then disappeared. Rachel turned to Tahoma. I'll make it across the Jordan. He studied her for a moment. You will. She stepped closer, was softer. By the time they reached the southern ridge, the landscape had turned sharp and foreign. Cactus thorns lined the trails like spears. Vultures circled above, silent witnesses to secrets buried in the sand. Rachel's legs ached from riding, her fingers blistered from rains and cold mornings. Yet she didn't complain. Not anymore. She had learned to read silence the way Tahoma read the sky. When glance, when shift of his shoulders, when pause, it all meant something now. They were within 30 days of the Beorden. Mexico shimmered like a distant promise, its sunlit plains just over the horizon. But promises didn't mean safety. Not yet. That evening, they reached a small canyon carved by centuries of storms. Tahoma signaled her to stop. His expression was tight. He dismounted, crouched low, pressed his palm to the earth. When he stood, his voice was low. Riders, behind us. 3, maybe 4. Close. Rachel's pulse quickened. She scanned the ridgeline, but the light was fading too fast. We can outrun them. Tahoma shook his head. Too open. We make stand. There. He pointed to a natural stone crevice halfway up the canyon wall. A ledge barely visible from below. They climbed, dragging supplies behind them. Rachel's fingers bled as she pulled herself over jagged rock. They settled in just as twilight fell, hearts pounding, breath held tight between teeth and prayer. Footsteps echoed below, boots grinding against gravel. Voices followed. Rachel tensed as she recognized Van. Well now, if it ain't the school teacher and her redskin shadow, a coarse growl echoed upward. She pressed her back to the stone, barely daring to breathe. Tahoma crouched beside her, hand resting lightly on the hilt of his blade. They waited. You can't hide forever, the man shouted. Come on out, Rachel. Let's end this clean. She closed her eyes. That voice belonged to Deputy Wade Callahan, the man who'd Vance tipped his head to her with a sneer, the same man who'd followed Judge Den like a loyal dog. He was never clean. He was never kind. Maybe I'll just start shooting shadows, Wade growled. Rachel touched Tahoma's arm. He looked at her. She shook her head slowly. If they spot us, we're trapped. He studied the canyon floor, then pointed to a narrow path winding toward a deeper bend in the cliff. His meaning was clear. They would move, quiet as breath. But quiet wasn't fast enough. A shot cracked. Stone splintered inches from Rachel's foot. She stumbled. Tahoma pulled her up and they ran, sideways across the ledge, dust scattering behind them. More gunfire. Shouts. Echoes. They reached the bend just as a bullet grazed Tahoma's shoulder. He grunted but didn't fall. Rachel turned, eyes blazing. She snatched the pistol from his belt and fired once, blind and desperate. A scream followed. Then silence. They dropped behind a fallen boulder, gasping. Blood darkened Tahoma's sleeve. Rachel tore a straight from her enden skirt and pressed it against the wound, hands trembling. You're not dying, she whispered fiercely. Not after all this. Tahoma winced but nodded. I won't. She held his gaze. There was no fear in his eyes, just pain and the strange calm he always carried, even in the face of death. Night deepened. The bandits didn't follow. Either her shot had hit, or the canyon had swallowed them whole. Rachel and Tahoma stayed huddled beneath the stone until the stars glittered too brightly to ignore. When it was safe, she helped him down the rocks. Each step was agony, but he didn't complain. She remembered how he looked the day they met, strong, untouchable, almost mythical. Now, bleeding and breathless, he looked human. And that made her care even more. They reached a sheltered grove near a stream by dawn. Rachel cleaned the wound, her hands steadier now. She had learned from him how to survive, how to endure. As she wrapped the cloth, he touched her wrist lightly. You saved me, he said. She laughed softly, more from nerves than humor. Guess we're even. He shook his head. No. You could have run. I've done enough running, she replied. They rested through the morning. When Tahoma slept, Rachel stared at the horizon. Mexico was close. A new name, a new life within reach. But every mile they traveled brought with it a question she hadn't dared ask. What happens after? By midday he stirred. She handed him water. He drank slowly, eyes fixed on her. You don't have to come further, he said. You'll be safe soon. She looked at him, chin lifting. I don't want to be safe without you. His breath caught. The wind rustled through the mesquite trees. It was the first time she'd spoken without armor, without sarcasm, without caution. Tahoma reached into his pouch and pulled out the card but she hadn't accepted days ago. He placed it in her hand. Now it's yours. Rachel ran her thumb over the smooth wings. What kind of bud is it? Doesn't matter, he answered. It remembers how to fly. They packed their things and continued south. The land turned golden. Cacti gave way to wild grass. By evening, they stood before the Rio Bravo, its waters murky and slow, but wide enough to feel like a Beordan between two versions of herself. She turned to him. You sure about this? He looked at the water, then at her. No. She smiled, small and tired. Me neither. They crossed together by the current. On the other side, they collapsed into the dust, soaked and laughing, barely but genuinely. It wasn't the end of tea. The village on the Mexican side was quiet, nestled between groves of mesquite trees and the low hills that rolled like sleeping giants. Adobe walls glowed gold in the sunlight. Children played barefoot, chasing chickens while old men smoked pipes on porches worn by time and weather. Rachel and Tahoma entered without fanfare. No one asked where they'd come from. No one asked why she limped or why he winced every step. In places carved from hardship, people recognized the shade of survival and respected its silence. They found a room in the back of a carpenter's house, a space barely large enough for two mats, a shelf, and a wash basin. Rachel swept the floor with a branch broom, humming softly. Tahoma cleaned his wound with bitter herbs, refusing to let her fuss over it anymore. The days passed in quiet rhythm. She taught a few of the village children to read English. He fixed broken shutters, helped dig irrigation trenches, and said little unless necessary. At night, they sat beneath the stars, legs just close enough to brush. She would speak of dreams, and he would listen, sometimes nodding, sometimes not, but always there. Rachel had never known peace like this, not the kind sold in Sunday sermons or whispered through cracked windows, but the kind that grew in the bones. She caught herself smiling at nothing. She caught herself watching him move, the way he never turned his back on a door, the way he walked as though the earth itself might shift beneath him. He never laughed loudly, but his eyes lit up sometimes when she teased him. That was enough. But peace, like firelight, always cast a shadow. When morning, a letter arrived. A boy with a limp handed it to her in the market, then vanished. The envelope was smudged, the handwriting rough. She opened it with trembling fingers. Van line. They crossed the river last night. 5 men. They have your name. Rachel folded the paper and tucked it into her dress. She didn't speak of it until sundown, after the children had gone home, after the village had curled into its nightly stillness. Tahoma read the letter once, then twice. He didn't curse. He didn't panic. They tracked us, she said. He nodded. You said we were safe. I said you were free, he replied. Freedom's never safe. She stood, pacing, heart pounding. We can't just wait. Not again. Tahoma folded the letter, slid it into the fire. We won't. They packed that night quietly. No goodbyes. Just quiet glances and soft footsteps over dirt floors. At dawn, They were already miles away, riding through the dry riverbeds and trails. But the men were faster. By the third day, Rachel spotted their dust cloud in the distance. Tahoma led them into a jagged canyon where the walls echoed every sound and the shadows stretched too far. They made camp in a cave high above the pass. Tahoma sharpened two blades. Rachel loaded the pistol, hands steady this time. She'd start pretending she wasn't part of this. She was. When night fell, the Rydans arrived, 5 of them, just like the letter said. Wade Callahan rode in front, his head tipped low, a smile carved deep into his face. "Well now, oh," he said to the firelight, unaware of the eyes watching from above. "Ain't this cozy?" Rachel aimed the pistol but held her fire. Tahoma touched her hand. "Wait," he whispered. Wade kept talking, as if the canyon were his stage. "You thought you could run? Cross the river, change your name? Ain't that sweet? But you forget, Rachel, Lowe's got long arms. And long memories." One of the other men dismounted, wandering too close to the cliff wall. Tahoma moved like a whisper. He dropped from the ledge with the silence of a ghost, landing behind the man before he could turn. The blade flashed. A gurgle. The body slumped. Gunfire exploded. The canyon came alive with echo and fire. Rachel ducked, heart pounding. She fired once, twice, when man fell. Then silence again. Wade had taken cover behind his horse. "You think you can scare me?" he shouted. "I seen worse than some savage with a knife." Tahoma's voice cut through the smoke. "Then you seen that." Rachel stood, gun raised. Her dress clung to her with sweat and dust, her hair tangled and wild. "You never saw me as a person, Wade," she said, loud and clear. "Just something to break. But I'm still standing." "Not for long," he snarled. A crack of tendon. Then another. Not from the sky, Rachel shot. Wade stumbled, then froze. Tahoma stepped into view, blood on his chest, knife still gripped tight. Wade looked between them, realization dawning too late. Rachel walked forward, asked Tahoma, and knelt beside the man who had once smirked at her suffering. His hand reached up. She looked him in the eye. "No more," she whispered. He died with her name on his lips, but not in power, only in fear. By morning it was over. They buried the bodies in silence, no words said, no prayers spoken. The earth took them as it had taken better men and worse. Rachel stood beside the last grave, wind brushing her cheeks like a memory. She felt no triumph, only release. They rode back to the village slowly. No one asked where they had been. Life picked up where it had paused, as if the storm had passed and the dust had chosen to settle again. Weeks later, Rachel stood outside the schoolhouse she had helped build, watching the children chase buds in the afternoon light. Tahoma sat nearby, carving a second bud, this one smaller, more delicate. When he handed it to her, she turned it over in her palm.